Welcome to another conversation in practical theology. If you are watching the video of this, then you will see that Eric and I are in the same place, and more about that in a moment. And if you're hearing the audio, then it's a real pleasure for us to be back at BIAPT, and also to be able to do this in person with each other. So the conversation that we're going to be having today is very much around the experience of being at a in-person event as opposed to one virtually, and what comes up for us, the differences, the pros, the cons, the benefits, and just exploring some of that. So where shall we begin?
I'd like to begin with mealtimes, actually,
Mm.
because I'd forgotten just how valuable the BIAPT coffee times and meal times are for chatting with people, not necessarily about conference stuff, but about who they are, whether it's new people or folks I've known at previous BIAPTs. And those were always really useful times, beneficial times when we were in person. And then you can't do those informal sort of coffee chats on Zoom. And so to be back being able to do BIAPT in person at the breaks, it's not to say anything negative about the rest of the content, but it's just to say that those meal times and refreshment breaks have been really, really beneficial, and it's only sort of day one and a bit into it.
It's fascinating because even as you say that, and I mean actually beforehand when we were thinking about the topic for today, one of the things I said was that this whole podcast happened because of an interaction that we had at a buyer conference where we met in person, and it wouldn't have happened if it was virtually. And I think that there is a huge benefit for doing things in person because of those informal pieces, as you say. You know, I've met so many new people who knew of me and who I knew virtually, but then when I saw each other, there was a familiarity, but it was different. And yet you have a 2-minute conversation with someone, and you've just connected at a much more deeper and even more human level.
I wonder if it's, I'll only speak for myself obviously, that it's not, you can't make a rapid escape in the way that you can online. I've joked sometimes about the disadvantage of going back into in person is you can't tap somebody on the forehead to mute them. And more seriously, the fact that you can't just make a brief excuse and say, we need to end the meeting, click.
Yeah.
You've actually got the whole social interaction about assembling and then disconnecting at the end in the in-person. Okay, you could be playing rude and just get up and walk away, but it's that non-escapability that actually for me makes some of those conversations go to the next stage. Because you might be pursuing something and think, actually, I wonder if we'll go to the next stage in that conversation. No, we'll just click end meeting.
Yeah.
But in person, that pause, the silence, the space bit, I think becomes much more crucial.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think we can create space virtually, but there's a different quality to it. When you're with somebody, certainly for me, it's easier to sit in silence because there's other information that I can read. You know, it's easier to be more reflective perhaps because when you're sitting in your own thoughts, the other person as well, and you're not consciously thinking, did they mute themselves? Can I not hear them? What else is going on? All of that kind of interference is gone. But also I think I can read somebody in a different way when I sit with them, you know, and that just immediately takes me so much deeper because I've got more information. I can sense what's the quality of the emotion in that space, what else is going on. You know, people will come and they will interrupt the conversations, and that also brings a lovely other dynamic to it. So I think it's it is much, much richer.
And I wonder if that's to do with we're continually then navigating the multi-sensory aspect of an in-person encounter.
Yeah,
It's so much more limited if you're sitting in your office, I'm sitting in my office, and we can probably cut out most of the other things. But actually, when we're sitting in person in a social space, we're not just responding to each other, we're responding to each other, responding to what's happening round about us.
yeah. And it's interesting because for me, the piece about the social space is that I don't know if you noticed, but I went to my room at about 8:30 yesterday, and I was very aware that a lot of the kind of social activity was happening around the bar, and I thought this is not a space that I want to be in, and so that it's wonderful that it exists, and so the kind of aspect of the bar and the kind of that social piece doesn't exist on Zoom. So for people who want to engage with it, it's brilliant. But for what's the alternative? And I think that kind of just brings an interesting curiosity for me.
Yeah, because there are social spaces that we're all more or less comfortable about,
Yeah,
that can be more or less appropriate for us to be in.
yeah,
And the variety of that, I think, is the answer.
yeah,
At a very practical level, I'm useless in a big hall where there's lots of tables and people talking because I really don't hear that well beyond just the next person to me.
yeah,
I was at a wedding the other day, and this setting for the reception was a big room that was very echoey, and it was those dreadful circular tables that I couldn't hear, and I don't lip read, but I need to see someone in order to be able to hear them a bit better.
yeah,
And other than the folks on either side, I really couldn't interact with the other folks because there was about 100 people in the room. Now, the social spaces accommodate us all in different ways, but there's something about it's less planned. If you're going to have a conversation on Zoom,
yeah,
you're going to be planning it.
yeah,
Whereas we've just sat and had a conversation with an old friend from
Yeah.
BIAPT that wasn't planned.
yeah.
It was much more organic and spontaneous.
No, and I'm looking back to the virtual BIAPTs and sending you a message saying, shall we meet for lunch? And so we had to very deliberately
Yes.
create a Zoom meeting where we met for lunch, you know, and it was a conscious effort on my part because I said, I was thinking I would have done that before. So just because it's virtual, why would I not do that now? You know, yet at this BIAPT, I knew we were going to meet, so I didn't have to go through that process of being deliberate because it's the informal, incidental, kind of accidental conversations that you're having with people that I think have made the whole thing much richer for me.
Yeah, I think that accidental or serendipitous or whatever sort of terms we want to put on it, that's the stuff of life. I certainly spend a lot of my professional life in pre-arranged meetings, which are fine and they're enjoyable most of the time, not all of the time. But that's different than spontaneity.
Do you know, as you say that, for me, I think what comes up is there's something like it feels like we're meeting old friends. So even a couple of people have come up to me about a paper that I gave at last year's conference, which was virtual, and just the warmth and the kindness with which they came to me. And when we meet in person, there is this energetic exchange that is happening with that, and it feels like I am meeting an old friend.
Yeah, and I think when that happens online, it's wonderful, but it's almost just like down a narrow funnel.
Yeah.
And it's sort of one-dimensional benefit.
Yeah.
Whereas the multi-dimensional aspects that you get surprised at,
it's more organic, I think, here, because I'm just thinking,
Mhm.
like, you were having a conversation with somebody, I came in, someone else comes in, you see some people that having a
Mhm.
discussion, you can naturally go in. That will never happen virtually because we can't see all of these spaces.
That's right. There's a higher degree of intentionality
Yeah,
with the online
yeah.
environments. Maybe if we were online all day and just had the thing running,
Mm.
but that would be that would be odd. I couldn't live with that.
Yeah, no, neither can I. But I am also thinking of my friends who are not here,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
who have very deliberately said that they don't want to come to an in-person conference,
Mm-hmm.
and the last 3 years of being virtual has been very helpful for
Mm-hmm.
them.
Mm-hmm.
And I too myself was thinking, do I want to take a full 3 days out to come to a conference? Because time-wise, it's harder. I met a couple of delegates that are day delegates. Why? Because they've got family responsibilities, and
Mm-hmm.
it's that there is a huge amount of advantage, but I think there's also a lot of disadvantage
Mm-hmm.
to
Mm-hmm.
being in person.
And that's, I think, now for almost all of us, the way that life is,
Mm,
that there are some things that we can do and we have to do online.
yeah.
And there are things that we can do and maybe even have to do in person.
Mm,
Um, it's like sharing really difficult information, news with someone. And in the TV dramas, the police will come to the house
yeah.
with, they will not telephone
Yeah.
and tell someone. And in these rom-coms where it's considered bad form to break up with someone by text.
Yeah.
It's about, there are some things that are important that have to be done in person if at all possible.
Mm. So where I'm going now is about the receipt and the exchange of
Mm-hmm.
information,
Mm-hmm.
right? So we receive what someone is saying to us
Mm-hmm.
intellectually, but we also receive it physically and emotionally,
Mm-hmm.
and we embody some of
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
what is happening within that
Mm-hmm.
exchange.
Mm-hmm.
And I think being in person with somebody enables more of a heard and a deeper felt sense of
Mm-hmm.
that.
Mm-hmm.
When it's virtual, perhaps because you're in different spaces, that exchange is slightly different because you're also in the comfort of your own
Mm-hmm.
home.
Mm-hmm.
So if someone's then giving you a difficult message and you
Mm-hmm.
want to disengage from it, perhaps it's easier to put a shield up because you're in your own home.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the spaces in which we have conversation should never be underestimated.
Mm.
Um, I love that phrase you just used about receiving from another because, yes, we exchange in conversation, but that receiving from, to me, speaks about real intentionality and discipline to be open to receive what someone else is saying, who someone else is, and then how are we going to offer them something for them to receive.
Yeah.
And to me, that's a lovely, unusual way of talking about it.
Mm. Mm. But I think as human beings, so bringing maybe a bit more of a theological dimension
Mm-hmm.
to it. Like one of the things that came up earlier on today is how are we having conversations with ourselves and with God, and
Mm-hmm.
and for me, a lot of that comes to how are we in relation with each other.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
so when we're in receipt, it's not just from that other person, it's also from the space that we've created. It's
Mm-hmm.
also, where are the other kind of thoughts and the emotions and other things, what's happening in our body that is more global. And within that, I think there is an aspect of God that comes in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, I mean, I'm unpacking it as I say it out loud. I'm wondering when I'm in my office and I'm in a Zoom meeting, I've really worked hard to set my environment up so that I can be completely focused on the person that I'm with, but it's through a screen. And I think that filter is wonderful because it means that, you know, I can attend conferences all over the world and speak with people all over the world, but that filter can also be a barrier. Here in this conversation, I can feel you, I can sense you. There's so much more, and so if I bring God into that, it feels to me as if God is part of our conversation too.
I wouldn't deny that about online conversation. It's maybe our sense
Yes.
of the divine is, we're of a generation that remember pre-digital.
Yeah.
And so we are different than the very young ones now. So maybe there's something in that. But sensing and being aware of the divine between, around, whatever language we want to use, it's more natural for us to think of that in person. But I wouldn't want to deny that in an online conversation at all. But our attunement to the divine, for some of us, is maybe more acute when we're in person.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I really like the word attunement, because I think you are right. I'm thinking, when was the last time I kind of thought about God's presence in a virtual meeting? I probably didn't, but I do in one way or another in every single in-person interaction that I have.
And that's partly to do with our upbringing and our previous experience. It's not so much to make a theological statement about whether God is or isn't more or less present in between people, whether it's an online or an inline, but our perception and our familiarity with that, and that practical theology word reflexivity maybe kicks in
differently.
Yes, differently. Not necessarily better, but differently when we're in person with someone.
And so I think there is a lot of value in being in person. But I also do think there's a lot of value in being virtual. And I mean, I'm not going to make any recommendations, but I think, for example, for conveners of conferences, because we're now in a different world, wouldn't it be great to do 1 year in person, 1 year virtual? And so that way people across the globe, if they do want to attend something, they the invitation can still be sent and received. If it's always in person, then people who had a huge amount of enthusiasm to attend virtually just won't do it anymore, you know. And the other side to that is, I know some people who refuse to attend virtual events and are back here, and it's lovely to be able to see them, and I haven't seen them for 3 years.
Yeah. And just as you're talking about the limits and the benefits of in-person and online, my mind goes to those folks who sustained amazing relationships through letters. And the stories of people when someone has passed on and they find the box of love letters from the wartime, or the first courting, and those letters have been preserved, and the importance of the embodiment of the written correspondence and the written relationship. We don't get that in person, we don't get it online, because it can be recorded, but who's going to go and take the recordings out of a little box under the bed that have been wrapped in a bit of ribbon and treasured? Nobody's going to do that with a recording. They might treasure them and store them in a digital way, but for the next generation, or even someone to find the box they'd forgotten, there's the love letters, or there's that correspondence with that friend. both the in-person and virtual don't have that. And those generations that grew up exchanging letters maybe twice a day, or maybe it had to be twice a year,
Yeah.
but they maintained relationship through written
Yeah.
correspondence. It's an astonishing achievement. From
Mm.
my perspective,
Mm.
doesn't write letters.
Mm. Do you know, it's interesting. I got an email recently
Mhm.
from one of my teachers,
Mhm.
taught me 35 years ago.
Mhm.
So I gave him a copy of my book a couple of
Mhm.
years ago, and when I received the email,
Mhm.
it felt to me as if they'd spent months
Mhm.
writing this
Mhm.
because it was so heartfelt. And so when you're describing the letters, I received his email like it was a handwritten letter,
Right. Okay.
you know,
Mhm.
and it moved me emotionally, you know, like it was just, I don't know, it was like the best report card I could ever have
Mhm.
asked for.
Mhm.
And my response to that was fascinating, because if he had written it, if I'd received it as a letter through the post,
Mhm.
would there be a difference in that?
Mhm.
And I don't think there would.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about the occasions when a former student will write a card to say thank you and say something of what they have appreciated about the content or the way or a conversation. That means more actually than if it's in an email.
Yeah.
It's nice if someone does it in email, but a handwritten card,
Special.
there is something special about that.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah, I could. You know, it's because I've got some students that are going to be graduating from the coaching training that I deliver. And last year I started to do something different, which was that I would write them a personalised card, like a tiny thing. But I thought I want to give them something that demonstrates my appreciation of their journey. And and it's a physical thing because I could email them. So my question here is, when we receive emails like this, do we just kind of like shrug our shoulders and say, "Oh, that's brilliant"? But when we receive it in a written form, that exchange of communication has got that richer quality.
I wonder if it's because it's unusual.
Mm.
I'm trying to remember back to the first emails that I received, and there was probably a feeling that those were special because that was a new way of communicating.
Yeah.
I've got an email, and now we say, oh no, I've got another email, because people either talk to you or they sent you a letter or they phoned or
Yeah.
something or another or sent a card, and it's maybe because it's special.
Yeah.
It's been a different way of doing it. That's
Yeah.
triggers, and there will be an embodiment.
Mm.
Yeah, you can print off an email and you can hold it and read it, and you can value what someone's done. But holding a card,
Yeah. It's different. Although
it's different.
I have to say, like, before we got married, my husband and my communication was all on email. You know, I mean, we'd meet and things, but most of the kind of critical pieces was via email. If that was by letter, I would have probably binned them. But I still have the emails. And I think that's a really interesting piece because 22 years later, I still have every single email. But how much would I have kept?
Yes.
So for me, there's this interesting value, and even like, did we keep our wedding cards? I can't remember. And I see adverts now for companies that will scan wedding cards
Oh yeah.
and make them into a book, so you don't keep the paper version anymore. And I just think, I'm not quite sure about that.
I know it protects them and you've got copies, but it's back to this in person thing.
Yeah.
There's something about a tangible, maybe the person that wrote that card or wrote that letter on that bit of paper. Their hand touched that.
Yes.
And I'm touching it, and there's a connection through the physicality of that, whereas it's all thoughts
Yeah.
on the email.
Yeah.
They never touch the bit of paper that I printed the email out on.
Yeah.
So I can get their words, I can sense them, I can remember them, but I can't touch something that they've touched.
And so bringing that to kind of like the human interaction, I think there is something about the fact that we are sitting in a shared space, you know, and so we've created a third thing in that space, right? I don't know what it's called, but if we do this virtually, it's your space and my space.
Yes.
And the third thing that's there is the filter, and I don't really have an emotive connection to it, but here I have a connection to this space and to this conversation in a way that's just different.
Yeah, and I think it's a much lesser form of what people will experience when they go and they revisit a place that they had gone maybe as a couple
Yeah.
or as parent and child, but they have to go alone.
Yeah.
But they had been there together.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? So my children and I went to Morocco recently for a weekend, and my husband didn't come, and the three of us spent most of our time saying, they're saying, Dad, we did this with Dad, and oh, I did this with Idris, and it was just very interesting, just the narrative of that conversation and the memories that it brought up for us, you know. So what you're saying, I think, is very, very valuable, because if I ever come back to this location, I will remember the first time I came here, and that was with Bayat, right? I can't even remember who my first Zoom meeting was with, right? It's just...
It doesn't have the same emotional attachment.
Yeah.
There's a tradition in Scotland of putting a little stone on a cairn if you get to the top of a mountain. And some of these cairns are quite big. But there's, in the Hebrew Bible, I don't recall them doing it in the New Testament, but in the Hebrew Bible, they'll put stones down as this was a special place. Sometimes it's a boundary marker, but also it's an identifying, not necessarily about holiness, but it's about identifying we were here and I was here, and then someone else comes along in a different time but puts another stone down there. So we're not connected in the same time, but we are connected to the same space.
Yeah.
And leaving a little stone, something like that, that's another form of this embodiment. And we've been there together, we've been there separately, and we can go back there even when the other isn't. And there's something very deep in our humanness.
Yeah. You know, I went to Knoydart recently on a hike, and one of the things that I did on the days when it wasn't raining was I would pray outside in the grass. And the first time I did that, I just had this really, really powerful emotive experience that the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, and probably most other Muslims in the history of time until now will never have touched that spot that I prayed in. And it was just interesting because you can see it in a picture, it's different, but when you're standing there and you're actually connected with God in the presence of all of the mountains and everything else, like, I now know that spot, and if I ever go back there, I will remember that spot, and it will bring up that memory for me, you know. And so your piece about kind of connecting through a different timeline with people that you don't even know, I think is very powerful.
So I remember that when I went to Israel the first time. I was there on my own, and it wasn't the great architectural holy sites that I connected with most, because those are interesting and lovely, but it was the countryside and being at the edge of the Sea of Galilee or up on the hillside traditionally associated with the Sermon on the Mount and stuff. And it was okay, it's not the same earth because it's all been redone and there's a car park and everything. But to be in the same place as Jesus, as the early disciples, as the crowd, as the Romans and the Jews and everybody, to be stepping there, a sense for me of connection to the ordinariness
Yes.
of it. And okay, there was the advantage that when I visited the very modern chapel on the Sermon on the Mount, there happened to be a group of, I think they were Nigerian soldiers, but they were UN peacekeepers with the blue berets, and they were singing hymns in the chapel of the Sermon on the Mount. And I thought, there's something here about peacemakers and peacekeepers, and so it was a very special sort of synergy of time, but it was about that physical locality. I don't get romantic about those sorts of religious places, but yet crossing the boundaries of time.
Yeah.
And that's true, I think, for us as in non-sacred spaces. There's also something about we were there, even if we're not there at the same time. And it's another part of this embodied encounter and engagement.
I'm conscious of time, and I'm thinking that maybe what we can do is we can come back to this conversation about pilgrimage, because that's kind of where I think we've got to. And I'm sure we had a conversation before about pilgrimage.
We've talked about pilgrimage.
We'll put a link into that one into the show notes of today, and maybe come back to it, because there's something for me about the curiosity could be, is it possible? What's happening to us psychologically when we're doing pilgrimage? Can we even do it virtually? And I obviously I don't mean about going to sacred spaces, but what happens to us when we visit a new conference or a new space or a new person and do it virtually versus in person, and what are the notions around that relating to pilgrimage?
Look forward to that.
Thank you. So if you're listening or watching, we'd love to hear what your comments are and what you've experienced in terms of differences about spaces, virtual, in person. What do you prefer? Is there anything that we've missed? And please do put your comments below this, or just send us an email and let us know what you think. And we would love to kind of engage with you and really have you part of this conversation as well. Thank you, Eric. Wonderful conversation as ever, and look forward to seeing you again, and look forward to being with you again in another conversation in practical theology.
Thank you, Saiyyidah. Thanks for watching and listening. Bye for now.